Everybody very quiet. The silent ocean. Welcome, everybody. My name's Andrew Steer. I'm the president and CEO here at the World Resources Institute. Welcome. It's a great honor to have you here. In this room, we have not only some of the political leaders that are driving this agenda, we have some of the world's leading technical and financial leaders. So thank you for coming. It's going to be a good discussion. The ocean is rising. Sadly, it's rising physically. Happily, it's rising politically right now. Amazing the amount of initiatives that are going on. But about 2 years ago, the government of Norway and 13 other, well, the Prime Minister of Norway and 13 other heads of state and government around the world said, look, it's great that this is happening, but it's not really adding up. And there's not really a narrative linking the ocean to human prosperity. We need one. Just as we developed one when it came to climate mitigation. 10 years ago, most people, most politicians, most CEOs, almost all of them, believe that it would be nice to act on climate change, but actually it's going to cost and you're going to lose growth, you're going to lose jobs, so it's a trade-off. Now, there's been one of the most important intellectual revolutions in the last 100 years in our understanding of economics. We now know that actually if you want sustainable growth, you must address climate change. Radical shift. And smart climate action will lead to more economic efficiency. It will drive new technology. It will provide long-term certainty. And those three things together are a very powerful cocktail that will drive more investment, more jobs, and a more sustainable future. And by the way, life will be much better for citizens as well. So we've seen that incredible revolution when it comes to climate change mitigation. We didn't have that kind of story when it came to the ocean, quite frankly. Everybody wanted to help. We had gone through several hundred years where we thought several thousand years when we thought the ocean was so huge, we couldn't hurt it. And then we suddenly realized the ocean was in crisis and it seemed then too big to actually solve the problem. And the question is, what should we do? And so I want to thank the government of Norway and the government of Palau, who chair the high-level panel on a sustainable ocean economy. They've been working now for a year, and they will launch their big report at the Lisbon summit next June. But in the meantime, they've been working incredibly imaginatively on what's the role of the ocean when it comes to climate change. And last week, at a wonderful meeting of these heads of state in New York, this report was discussed. I want to tell you about it in a little movie right now. Take a look at this.
Climate change is the defining challenge of our generation. The greenhouse gases we pump into our atmosphere are heating the planet dangerously fast. Scientists warn that global temperatures must not rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius if we are to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Unless we act fast to cut our emissions, temperatures will rise far more than that. This would change life on the planet as we know it. The ocean is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. It regulates our atmosphere, absorbing 93% of the heat caused by our emissions and over 25% of our excess carbon. Yet our ocean is at breaking point. It's getting hotter, higher, and more acidic as the planet heats. The High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, a group of 14 heads of government, asked experts to find solutions. Their major new study finds that the ocean may hold the key to its own survival, and ours. It offers a set of ocean solutions to cut a fifth of the emissions needed to limit global temperature rise. This would be equivalent to taking 2.5 billion cars off the road each year. How can we use the ocean to help fight climate change? We can develop renewable offshore energy. We can make ships carbon neutral. We can protect and grow natural capital like mangroves and seagrass, which capture carbon. We can develop low carbon sources of protein from the ocean, seafood, seaweed and kelp, and much more. These actions would not only help curb climate change, they would also help us protect coastal communities from storms, protect food security, improve air quality, and provide jobs. With the right political will and investment, we can avert climate change and build a new blue ocean economy that is sustainable and treads lightly on our ocean. The ocean is not too big to fail, nor is it too big to fix. It is too big to ignore, and our very future may depend on it.
Compelling, isn't it? I sort of feel we can go home now. We've got the message. But no, there is actually a lot to discuss. And it's been a great honor, I should say, for the World Resources Institute to provide the sort of some of the content and some of the secretariat of this panel. It's also a high-level expert group and a high-level advisory group. We're going to be hearing from the co-chair of the expert group, Peter, just a little bit later. So I wanted just to tell you what's going to happen. It's a great honor here. We have three of Washington's finest ambassadors here from Norway, from Chile, and from Mexico. It's a great honor to have them here. We're going to hear first from Ambassador Kåre Aas from Norway, and then from Ambassador from Chile. We're then going to have a panel chaired by Craig Hanson, who's our Vice President here for food, forest, water, and the ocean. And they all relate to each other, of course. And then we're going to sort of sum it all up. And in the process, we're going to hopefully have a real discussion here. So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to introduce Ambassador Kåre Aas, who has been personally a great leader in this field and a great friend of ours and many people, and we're really grateful for what you've done. You've been here 6 years, and before that you were in Afghanistan. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here, and thanks to you, Andrew, for your introductory remarks, and also great to be here with my colleague Ambassador Navarro, and also Ambassador Miranda from Mexico. So it's wonderful to be here with so many ocean friends. And I really would like to thank the World Resources Institute for organizing this event and for the close cooperation you have with Norway. You really play an important role in building knowledge and awareness around the need for a sustainable ocean economy. For my country, Norway, the ocean has been the backbone of our economy for centuries. It began with fishing, then shipbuilding. It so expanded into oil and gas. Today, however, we've discovered that Norwegian waters are exceptionally well adequate for offshore wind too. Norway's ocean industries provide 2/3 of our export and 10% of our labor force. And I would also like to say that the oceans has also really an important Arctic dimension to my country, Norway being an Arctic country. There's a lot we don't know about the future, but one thing is sure, Norway will continue to rely on the ocean and thus continue being a strong advocate for sustainable and responsible ocean management. As we heard from Andrew Steer last week in New York, the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy released their very first report in the nexus of the ocean and climate. This was a milestone because for the first time, and we saw that on the video, scientists have quantified the contribution the ocean can provide in reducing climate gas emission. This is an important step in showing that a transition to a sustainable ocean economy will play a significant role in the global response to climate change. The report has found that ocean-based climate solution can deliver up to 1/5 of the annual cut to greenhouse gas emission and needed by 2050 to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as we heard, that's equivalent to 2.5 billion cars off the road each year. We are fortunate to have 3 of the scientists who worked on the report present here today. And I really want a special welcome to Peter Haugen, my countryman from the University of Bergen. But it's also great to have your colleague here, Peter. And I really look forward to hearing their presentation and discussion. When Norway's Prime Minister Erna Solberg had the idea to establish the high-level panel, she invited 13 fellow heads of government to join her in creating a to-do list for the ocean. The panel, as we also heard from Andrew Steer, she co-chaired that with the President, Riemann Gassau of Palau. The other members, and you see them all here, are the heads of governments from Australia, Chile, Canada, Fiji, Kenya, Mexico, Namibia, and Portugal. And I would like to thank Chile, Fiji, Jamaica, Kenya, Mexico, Namibia, and Palau for co-hosting this event with us today, this morning. So the idea behind the high-level panel is to facilitate the development of concrete, science-based solutions that countries can benefit from in their transition towards a sustainable ocean economy. And these efforts will also ultimately help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to the ocean and climate nexus that will be discussed here today, the panel has identified several other topics that are key in building a sustainable ocean economy. To create a basis for the panel's further policy recommendations, they have commissioned 16 blue papers. Among them are papers on coastal development, ocean energy, illegal fishing, food production, and marine waste. They all focus on how we can achieve a more sustainable and prosperous relationship with the ocean. The first blue paper will be released worldwide next month. We will have the rest of the papers released through the rest of this year and until the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon in June 2020. I look forward to receiving all of them, and I'm sure you do the same. In Lisbon, at the Ocean Conference, the panel will present the final recommendations, as we heard from Andrew Steer too, based on all the input received through the blue papers. In many ways, that's when the real work starts for each and every government and ocean stakeholders around the world. The hope is that the panel's recommendations will contribute positively towards government policies and actions relating to the ocean. The 14 panel members collectively represents 30% of the world's coastal states, all of which are at different stages of development. Together, they underscore the international cooperation required to ensure a sustainable and responsible use of the ocean. The panel is further supported by a global group of scientists, a network of business and civil society, and a dedicated secretariat here at the World Resource Institute under the able leadership of Andrew Steer, Craig Hanson, and the whole staff. And I really want to thank you for your efforts and what you are doing on a daily basis. The panel members firmly believe that the ocean holds the key to solving many of the most challenging tasks facing the world today. Not only combating climate change, but also eradicating hunger and extreme poverty, fighting disease and pandemics, ensuring affordable and clean energy for all. Today's events, discussing the panel's first report on the ocean and climate, is the first of several upcoming high-level panel events here in the United States. With the World Resources Institute and fellow embassies, we will together present key blue papers commissioned by the panel for ocean stakeholders here in Washington DC, but also all around the country. We have to get out of the city to also engage with Americans on the West Coast, East Coast, and also among my fellow Norwegian Americans in the Midwest. There are 5 million of them there, as there are 5 million in Norway, okay? And they came, the first one came in a Viking ship, you know that? That was long before this gentleman named Christopher Columbus, okay? Norway is an ocean state and has long been a champion for the ocean. We will continue to be the forefront of international efforts, promoting sustainable use and value creation, ensuring a clean and healthy ocean, and supporting the emerging blue economy. Our ambition is to use events like today's to engage with national and international ocean stakeholders and promote a healthy and wealthy ocean. I'm really honored to be here today and look very much forward to the upcoming presentation and following discussion. So thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was brilliant. And well done on the Vikings. I do. Although I don't know what you guys did to my country, by the way. I come from England. So that was fantastic. It's now a great honor to invite the ambassador of Chile, Alfonso Silva Navarro. I think everybody knows here, Chile has been a leader in marine protected areas and many other aspects of the ocean, and how wonderful it is that you're going to be hosting the climate change COP in just a couple of months, and you're calling it the Blue COP to really make sure that we all understand these issues. So it's a great honor, sir. The floor is yours.
Good morning to all. Dr. Steer, Ambassador Kåre Aas, Dr. Peter Hagen. And as they say in the Caribbean, all protocols observed. And that's the care of everyone. So thank you very much. We already mentioned that the UN was a great opportunity to focus on Blue Ocean, and our president was there in every single panel and every single occasion, hammering on these issues and on COP25. So I'm following the steps. I'm beginning hammering on COP25. This year we will host the COP25, and we are really committed to in our country, and we have a clear ocean vocation. The sea is part of our identity and an important element on our social, economic, and cultural development. Moreover, Chile has one of the largest exclusive economic zones. For instance, to give you an example, we are responsible on air rescue, and the next neighbor in the Pacific is the zone of Australia. This is how broad it might be. So our aim is that COP25 will lead to higher levels of ambition, highlighting ocean-based climate action, although there are several venues under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, where ocean-related aspects are considered as a clear need to further promote action and increase visibility in the climate policy realm, provided that environmental integrity and accountability are ensured. The ocean is currently responsible for capturing 50% of greenhouse gases and also capturing more than 90% of the temperature that we generate. This is part of the solution. This is the ocean that provides for us this kind of solution. So the United for Science report, as it was mentioned here, shows how the degree of acidification and deoxygenization is affecting our ocean, killing marine life. Therefore, COP in Chile is going to be, as I mentioned here again, the Blue COP, because blue, without blue, there is no green, and without green, there is no life. This is what our president mentioned at the United Nations. This is why the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy is such an important initiative. The mitigation potential of the 5 areas of this group has defined are critical to fight climate change and have the potential to generate several economical, social, and environmental benefits, like employment opportunities, coastal resilience, positive health impacts, such as shifting diets toward low-carbon ocean-based protein, as was presented here, enhance global food security, and also biodiversity protection, reduce ocean acidification, among others. This is not easy. It will require greater political will, clear policy signals to support private sector engagement, finance mechanism, and development of new technologies, areas where Chile is fully committed. After all, as President Piñera said, the success of the COP is absolutely necessary and indispensable, not just for Chile, but for the whole humankind. It's not the world that is in danger, it's our own survival. One of the priorities for her presidency has been to highlight the importance of using science as a vehicle, not only for knowledge, but for action. Science has shown us the urgency of taking ocean-related climate actions as soon as possible in a series of scientific reports recently published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The special report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate recognizes that all people on Earth depend directly or indirectly on the ocean and cryosphere, and that these elements are already critical, affected the climate change. Is it urgent to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time adopt transformative adaptation measures? We need to promote resilience through technology, recognizing the costs and difficulties of developing countries. For all of this, cooperation and knowledge exchange institutional support is most necessary. In a low emissions situation, the projections to the next century is not very encouraging. During the 21st century, it is projected that the ocean will go to unprecedented conditions with rising temperatures, more acidification, decreased oxygen, and frequent marine heat waves. Fishing will also be greatly affected. For this reason, Chile has announced the creation of a platform of solution for the ocean based on science as a legacy of the Blue COP, which is a website that works as a solution repository created to share concrete solutions to the consequence of climate change with the ocean. Also, the lead by example, a specific national task has been committed. Development of an ocean component of an NDC, development of the assessment of mitigation and adaptation con benefits of marine protected areas, creation of a national policy to combat acidification, and putting in place a more ambitious national fisheries and aquaculture plan. In addition, as presidency, we have announced a multi-stakeholder alliance that will lead efforts toward the Santiago Climate Change Conference in December on both mitigation and adaptation, the Climate Ambition Alliance. The alliance brings together 59 nations, ramping up actions by submitting the enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDCs, by 2020. An additional 11 states have already started an internal process to increase ambition, as well as 65 countries and the EU, 10 regions, 102 cities, 93 businesses, and 12 investors, all working towards achieving net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Chile will continue its effort toward COP25 to encourage other nations, regions, cities, businesses, and investors to join the Climate Ambition Alliance. In this regard, we would like to announce that our Minister of Environment, Carolina Schmidt, will come to Washington, D.C. on October 29 to engage other entities in this initiative and also to discuss Chile objectives for COP25, with an emphasis on the ocean-based climate action. Well, with this invitation, I would like to finish my remarks. Thanks again to the high-level panel, to the WRI, and all the countries involved in this event and your leaders to make this COP25 a landmark for action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was wonderful. It's fantastic to see the leadership of Chile as we come to COP25. So thank you very much. And your point about the NDC is really important. I mean, as countries by the end of next year strengthen their NDCs, it's really important that ocean issues get factored in much more. So thank you very much indeed. We now roll up our sleeves and we're going to have a panel up here. And I'm going to call upon Craig Hanson. Craig actually is sort of, I was going to say typical of WRI, but he indicates the kind of guy we're trying to recruit here. Rhodes Scholar, highly successful career at McKinsey. And then he says, actually, I want my best professional years to change the world, to promote the kind of disruptive change that we need to get to where we need to get to. So Great, I've never introduced you like that before, have I? You're blushing, so come on up here. Great.
Thank you. Thank you. McKinsey is disruptive in a different way. So great. So ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Welcome to the session. You're probably now kind of ready to figure out, so what's in this report, right? So first of all, on your chairs when you came in, there's the short version. That's kind of for the metro ride. Then there's the long version. That's for the evening or the morning commute. And this is a novel piece. No one's done something like this before. As you're going to hear in a moment, there's a lot of research about the challenges the ocean faces. The ocean is a victim, but this is one of the first analyses by some of the world's top leading scientists on the ocean about, well, what can this ocean do more in terms of being a solution? So this really is a groundbreaking piece of analysis. And what we're going to do first is I'm going to bring up one of the co-chairs of the expert group. Remember, Ambassador Aas talked about the high-level panel actually having an expert panel. We brought together about 50 of the world's premier thinkers from all over the planet on natural sciences, ocean sciences, economics, human development, social development, to really be part of and support the high-level panel. We have several co-chairs. One of them is with us today. That's Dr. Peter Haugen. He is the program director of the Institute of Marine Research out of Norway. He's also the past chair of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. So he knows a tad bit about the ocean, given his career. And so he's one of the co-chairs, along with the Honorable Mary Pangestu, who used to be she's actually at the University of Indonesia now, used to be the Trade Minister of Indonesia, as well as the Tourism Minister of Indonesia, as well as Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who used to run NOAA under the Obama administration. So it's an esteemed group of co-chairs. We're pleased to have Peter here to actually walk us through the key findings of the ocean as a solution to climate change. And then after Peter, we will then have a panel session with Peter and two other authors, and then a time for questions. So as you hear the presentation, as you have questions, remember those, because we have a chance actually for you to speak with some of the co-authors themselves. So without further ado, I will invite Peter to the podium. Peter.
Thank you very much, Craig, and dear ambassadors and everybody present. Thanks for being here, and thanks for making this possible, World Resources Institute. I would actually like to start with thanking the heads of state, the 14 heads of state of the high-level panel for their vision and their request to us to actually produce this report. This is a report, I think, that would never have emerged from a normal bottom-up process in the science community, where people get together and find an issue and publish and send something to a journal. It's really a good example of what I would call demand-driven science. They ask us to investigate this, and we try to do our best. And it was a demanding task, I can tell you that, but an enjoyable one. And I hope you will agree with me on that. Let's see. So this is the report, 18 co-authors. We recruited Ove Høg Gullberg as the coordinating lead author of this, and 2 of the other co-authors are here. It was presented last week in New York and has created quite a bit of press attention. Here is, you probably can't read the Norwegian one there. The ocean can be used to save the climate is the one over there. And the others are in sort of the same direction. So this is really a companion to the climate panel special report on oceans and climates and cryosphere, where you see a lot of the impacts of climate change on the ocean. We are looking at what can we do, what can be done in the ocean and with human action related to the ocean. There was also an accompanying article in Science last Friday. The ocean is a key to achieving climate and societal goals. That also makes this link between the IPCC report and our report very clear, much clearer than perhaps people have realized before. We concentrate on the content in our report, but they are actually companions. So as already mentioned, we are a large group of experts that we have put together to serve the high-level panel, not only for this report, but for the later blue papers and for input to a synthesis that will be presented to the heads of state. And I have 2 other co-chairs of the expert group. So we recruited a lead author for this, Ove Høg Gullberg, and I won't go through all the names here, but you see, when we want to cover a range of topics like these 5 sectors of the ocean economy, then we need different experts, because not many are experts on all of this, and we like to make sure we have the top expertise in each area, and we like to make sure we are able to integrate that with people who can do that. I should also mention that the report has been out for review, external review, and I think more than 20 reviewers have been looking at the report, people outside of this writing community, providing useful input and making sure that we are on track with the quality of what we deliver. Because it is a demanding task. Okay, so what do we find? First of all, ocean-based climate action can play a much bigger role in shrinking the world's carbon footprint than was previously thought. I must admit, I have never seen any report trying to even address this, to even give a quantitative answer to what is the potential contribution. And what people previously thought may be individual, but I think most of us would say that we didn't expect this. So this is about 1/5 of the greenhouse gas emission reductions that is needed. This is based on the gap between a business as usual scenario and a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. This is the way we approach this. There is United Nations Environment produced these emission gap reports. That is the basis for this. And yes, this is bigger than the current emissions from coal-fired power plants worldwide. It is also bigger than what comes from a number of cars, as was shown in the video. So we know that, and has already been mentioned, the ocean is crucial in oxygen. It absorbs CO2 emissions, and it absorbs a large portion of the heat related to greenhouse warming. This is really elaborated in this recent report that is also a quite useful thing, and it's more than a metro ride to read that one, I think. It's probably a full day train ride to get through that one. Even the summary for policymakers is quite extensive. Yeah. But what do we find? I'll walk you through this briefly. So the 5 topics we've looked at is ocean-based renewable energy. So that is offshore wind, it's wave, tidal energy, ocean thermal energy conversion, potentially also other forms of energy, which are smaller. A big fraction could be done by 2050, up to more than 5 gigatons CO2, assuming that we substitute other sources of electricity and power, and that this power doesn't come in addition to what we already have. I mean, there are things here that we have to take into account to make sure that these substitutions are really working. Domestic and international shipping and transport is also a very substantial contributor. This has been addressed by IMO, International Maritime Organization, but we push this further and give an update on in fact, recommendations and priorities that should be followed up both in IMO and also nationally to achieve this and get beyond it. Then we have blue carbon ecosystems. Blue carbon is the name of the carbon associated with ecosystems in the coastal regime and in the marine. We've talked about green carbon on forestry and on land, but blue carbon is really an area where we have had too little attention until very recently on how this could play a part, even in nationally determined contributions, as has been mentioned. This is an active area of research where, again, much more activity is needed. And then food from the ocean. So that's fisheries, capture fisheries, is aquaculture, reducing emissions in those, and is also shifting diets, making people eat more seafood of different kinds than we do today, and various ways of doing this. And we have a scientific approaches to how to estimate the possibilities there. And then the fifth one, storage of carbon in the seabed. So that would be carbon capture, typically from power plants, transport of liquid carbon by pipelines, and storing it in the seafloor underneath the seabed. This is an option that we make some caveats about. It is such carbon storage is going on in the North Sea right now, based on CO2 coming from natural gas production. So it's possible to do that, but whether it is competitive and will contribute as we foresee here depends on more both environmental and cost engineering studies, I would say. When it comes to the ocean-based renewable energy, in particular offshore wind, we have much more literature saying that this is cost competitive and is going to be with the technology development that is going on. But the other four sectors, things we can implement right now. The technology is there, we can just go ahead. So this is a graphic representation of this. So you see we distinguish between domestic shipping and international shipping because of different regimes of dealing with that. We talk about aquaculture, we talk about ocean energy from offshore wind and other sources of energy. So you see offshore wind is considered the biggest one, and other forms of ocean energy are combined together. And then, of course, capture fisheries and farming. Seaweed farming is one option coming up here, which maybe we can talk about later, which is quite interesting, what we can do about that. Mangroves, salt marshes, and seabed storage, seagrass. So when we look at the potential here, how do we do that? And I'm not going to make this a long lecture on how we actually go through it, but I think this is important to capture. First, for example, geophysical. The availability of wind energy over the ocean is immense. It makes no point in trying to estimate what's the size of that energy. We're not going to capture that all over the place in the Southern Ocean anyway. So that's the geophysical potential. The technical potential is where we can actually go out and do this in a reasonable way. And then the economic, then the costs come in. Is this competitive? Is it really something we can do? And then are these actions socially and politically acceptable and possible to do? So this shrinks, and we do take these into account. And again, this is the overview. I'm not going to read this. We look not only at 2050, we look also at 2030 potential, and you can see that some of the estimates that we make are, not necessarily linear throughout. It depends on various attributes of the different options. But the percentage of the emission gap that we're looking for is, a little bit less in 2030, actually, larger in 2050, and of course it's larger for the 2 degree than for the 1.5 degree. So this is a way of showing it perhaps more clearly than the previous one. Looking at 2050 and the number of gigatons of CO2 equivalents, how they add up based on this estimate. So you can see all of these are significant. None of them are, negligible. Energy here turns out to be bigger than the others, but each and every one of them is possible to implement, and has also a number of benefits if we do so. There are more reports in there. So this is huge. I mean, this is really something that I, as an ocean scientist, and everybody who cares about the ocean, we should do our part in the ocean to reduce this. And we can really do this. So explaining once more, the business as usual, or the current policy baseline, that projects the CO2 emissions up to 2050, the 1.5 and 2 degrees pathways here, and how much we can actually take off that gap by these 5 options is what we show in this figure. So again, it becomes a larger fraction if we are with the 2 degree, because if we want to go down to 1.5 degree, we have to do more, and we have to then add other actions in addition to the ones we propose here. They are limited by various attributes of each of them, and not by the total CO2 here. So once more, for renewable energy, scaling up offshore wind, there's a lot of things happening in offshore wind these days. We're moving from, bottom fixed offshore wind to floating offshore wind. They're getting bigger, economies of scale are coming in, and this is possible to make a huge contribution. And then the other forms of ocean energy are also, with many technical estimates, quite promising in the 2050 timescale. These shipping, domestic and international, shipping is the biggest one. Domestic short sea shipping is smaller, but that's where perhaps some of the most action is happening right now, electrification, even hydrogen, and we move into other forms of fuel. But much of these can also be achieved by actually reducing energy use, logistics, better hull shapes, reducing energy use in the present fuel in the short term. And that's actually, again, an example of a win-win solution. You save money if you save fuel. So there's some really simple things to be done here. And then the coastal and marine ecosystem conservation and restoration. Here are different components here. The loss of mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses, and then restoring them. And then some interesting possibilities with upscaling of macroalgal production. And then also we've looked at overexploitation of ocean fisheries, but find that we are not able to quantify that. So we don't include it. There are issues like that in here, issues that we could look at more, and where we may even add more possibilities than what we have dared to quantify here. And ocean foods, even if reducing emissions from wild fish capture fishing vessels seems like a small number here, of course, this is something we should do. I mean, we should be more efficient. We should make sure that we don't emit more than we need to capture the fish that we actually have, and we should use the fish better than we are doing today. And also aquaculture, and there again, some of the feed is quite an important issue. But look at this, increasing the share of ocean-based protein in diets. Ocean-based diets are much less carbon intensive than most land-based food. So this is actually, it seems like a no-brainer, but you have to make people want to eat these foods, and you have to make sure that we are actually able to deliver that. And then here we say for CO2 storage in the seabed that additional research is required. But if we look at the existing power plants which are close to shore, and if we implement carbon capture and storage in those, we come up with a considerable potential here as well. So we take that into account as well. This one, I think, is an important graph, and I'm not going to bother you with too many graphs now, but this one, I think I'd like you to pay attention to the color hue of this one here. This is looking at co-benefits and trade-offs if we implement these 5 action areas that we have looked at. And you see most of them are green up to dark green. There are a few light red ones, possible conflicts. So if we look at, for example, ocean-based renewable energy, there's one there, maybe SDG 14 is an issue. Maybe it's a negative impact. Well, what is this? Well, this is competition on space in the offshore environment. But a light red here doesn't mean that this is insoluble. It just means we have to pay attention to it. It can be done. We can have the implementation of offshore wind energy, for example, without a negative impact on the marine environment. If we do it right, we just need to pay attention to it. But the co-benefits are so large. These are win-win-win solutions almost all over the place. And while we here have the focus on climate and the other effects are looked at on its co-benefits or trade-offs, Many of the later blue papers and the studies we will do will look at each of similar activities for other reasons than climate. And then we need to keep in mind that, in fact, they also work well for climate. Okay, I think that was my quick run through on the findings. I have not said very much about the priorities for policy, priorities for research, priorities for technology that we have included in the report. We can discuss some of that. I concentrated on the findings now, and I think I'll be happy to certainly discuss with you what the implications are and how we can deal with this in the future. And again, it's really great to be here with you, with this audience, and I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. A nice, very quick summary of what's in the report. Now we're going to turn into a panel. We're going to go into a little bit of detail now on many of the issues that Peter talked about. Then we'll turn things over for a Q&A. So I'm going to call up to the podium here three individuals. Dr. Peter Hogan, again, please come forward. Dr. Steve Gaines. Steve is a co-author of the report as well. He's the Dean and Distinguished Professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So thank you for coming out for this event. And then Manaswita Konar, we call her Manzi, is an ocean economist here at the World Resources Institute and did a lot of the economic analysis for this work here. So welcome. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists. There we go. It's back again. There we go. I'd like to kick off here with just some general ones before we go into the actual various aspects of the report. Steve, in light of the IPCC's special report on the ocean and cryosphere that came out last week, that many of you, how many of you heard about that one you saw the news stories, the ocean's in trouble? Yeah. What does this report, the 5 opportunities for ocean action, in your view, does it provide some hope vis-a-vis that doom and gloom report from last week?
Yes, I think it provides a lot of hope and optimism, and I think that because of the fact that it focuses on solutions, and there have been a number of studies over the last 20 years about how challenging things are in the ocean, but we rarely step back and say, what's the potential from a concerted effort and solutions? And I think, as Peter noted, one of the powerful things in this case is it brought together people that were working on lots of pieces of this problem that never talked to each other. And it kind of forced an effort to think about what's the cumulative effect. I think it's also optimistic because it's underestimating what the potential is, because we highlight a number of things where we still don't have the scientific data to really make a firm prediction, but there are potential components of benefits that come from other sectors.
And building on that, Manzi, why do you think that ocean-based actions or solutions have gotten so little attention thus far?
Well, I think because we are land-based beings. So ocean exploration is very new compared to all the work that has happened on land in terms of GHG mitigation and research. It's positive that we have more research and attention on it at the moment, but we are still playing catch up. So for example, agricultural practices, it has been going on centuries on land, but aquaculture is very new when it comes to marine aquaculture. Green carbon is a very, it's a old concept, but blue carbon is a relatively new concept. So the good news is we have this report and a lot of exciting research that's going to be a part of the high-level panel.
Great, thanks, Manzi. Peter, what did you find? You've been studying the ocean for quite some time. What did you find that was unexpected?
Well, I think the sheer magnitude of the contributions that we can get here, because I think that tells us that we should put much more attention to actually each of these. They are all big, they're all significant, and we really need to put more attention into it.
Steve, I saw you nodding your head on that one. What surprised you?
Exactly the same. I think it's the fact that some of these components, even the one that I have worked on turned out to be substantially larger than we anticipated when we first started this effort. So I think that that's the surprising and positive side of this whole analysis.
Mansi, what was new for you?
So the IPCC 1.5 report didn't really cover oceans in terms of looking at the impacts on the sustainable development dimensions and SDGs. So for me, when we were doing the research, it was a very exciting piece of new research that looked at how the core benefits outweighed the trade-offs.
Great. I'm going to dive into some of the 5 action areas now. I'm going to start off here with fisheries. How many people in the room eat fish? How many of you in the room eat like shellfish, like mussels and stuff like that? Okay. All right. How many eat salmon? Norway's in the room. Better raise your hand. There we go. All right. And Chile's in the room. Yeah, you got both of your countries are, and I got a Scottish president. So I guess I have the 3 biggest salmon producers. Any Alaskans in the room? So Steve, I mean, I found the section on fisheries on the food systems quite interesting in the report. What, in terms of mitigation potential, has this been examined before in this way when it comes to aquaculture and wild capture fisheries and benthic organisms? Has it been looked at this way before?
Not really in a comprehensive way. And I think that's what, this is symptomatic, I think, of other parts of this analysis, is that there are many parts of this sector that people have looked at, but they've looked at narrow little segments and not stepped back to say, where are the really big opportunities? And so we've actually spent a lot of time documenting the potential solutions that are quite minor, and in some cases have ignored the parts which are orders of magnitude bigger. And so there's a big part of this which has really been kind of bringing together the synthesis on the food side, the greater efficiencies, the opportunities on the fishery side, the new technological advances that are happening in aquaculture, and what, if they're done in the right way, how they can affect the carbon footprint of more food production. But the factor that comes out of this in a striking way is how big an effect diet choice is in terms of the future. And a big part of this is driven by the fact that there's projections of a very large increase in global demand for animal protein over the coming 3 decades. And depending upon how much of that actually gets consumed and what types of animal protein you're talking about orders of magnitude difference in the overall carbon footprint that could happen from that. And the ocean has the potential of being an enormous part of the solution because of the fact that well done sustainable aquaculture has a far smaller carbon footprint per unit of animal protein than any options on land. And it provides a really big opportunity. But I mean, I think, and this was the other, I think, key part of this analysis, is that there was a really wonderful study that was done by Eat Lancet on the diet potential, the effects of potential changes in diet on the climate change problem. The challenge with that, and it's enormous. I mean, if you look at what they came up with, that a shift to diet that's planetary friendly for the planet would be comparable in input to what the renewable energy production was, way bigger than what we projected. But that involves an enormous amount of behavior change. And so the other thing that we did in this was to try to look at the available science that suggests what's realistic expectations that could be done by aggressive efforts, both with pricing the negative effects of carbon into foods by perhaps things like a carbon tax, versus also focusing on the other benefits that come out of changes in diets. And from that, we came up with this estimate, which is about 15% of that change. But a big part of this is really thinking about how do we motivate behavior change?
Can you just describe, for those that haven't read the report yet, some of the shifts you're talking about? Is this about eating more salmon? Is it eating more mussels? What are the shifts you talk about?
So yeah, good question. I mean, so there are obviously a lot of options for food that comes from the sea, and there's been an extensive number of analyses of looking at what the global carbon footprint is of different forms of food production from the ocean, and they vary a lot. And some of the lowest tend to be items like shellfish, because of the fact that we are not having to provide feed for them. Whereas if we look at finfish, we're having to provide feed. But it still can be dramatically lower than the same kinds of animal protein that we grow on land. And there's a variety of actually very simple reasons why it's so much more efficient. One is on land, everything we eat on the animal side of things is warm-blooded. In the ocean, virtually everything is cold-blooded, with a couple of exceptions. And that's a huge efficiency gain. The second is that gravity helps solve this problem in a very big way, because in the ocean, you don't have to put a huge amount of energy into producing a giant skeleton, which you do on land. That creates a big inefficiency in terms of growing food. And then the third one is we can grow food vertically in the ocean way easier than we can grow animal food vertically on land. And if you combine those three things, it's a huge efficiency gain of eating the right foods from the planet. So there's a lot of variability within ocean foods, but on average, done well using best practices, ocean foods tend to have a way lower carbon footprint than land-based foods.
Just goes to show that 10th grade biology and physics still applies today, right? So good. I don't put one more thing on the co-benefits, right? I was interested to read about some of the co-benefits of this shift for just biomass in general on the ocean. Tell us about that.
Yes, so part of the benefits, if we look at wild fisheries, a big part of the reduction here comes from the fact that we have over many decades overfished many of the world's fisheries. And as a consequence, we actually expend more effort to catch a fish than we should if we were managing those well. And so a big part of our analysis is looking at if we actually focus on better management of fisheries, and we know where to do that, and we know a lot of ways to do that in very effective ways. We just need to scale these solutions. That leads to not only a lower carbon footprint for fish, because if there's more fish in the ocean, you actually have to have less effort to catch them. And we estimated it's about you would cut fishing effort in half to catch more fish. So that's a huge efficiency gain that comes out of fixing fisheries. So that's one. And that means that you get more fish in the ocean, depending upon how aggressive this goes, somewhere between a 60 and we estimated somewhere between on the fishing side, 50 and 100% increase in the abundance of fish in the ocean. That's big. An increase in fish production of between, say, 13 and 20% in that range, and a substantial increase in profits. So there's enormous benefits on the fishery side. On the shifting diets, the primary aspect in terms of benefits here is really thinking about two things. One is that changing diets doesn't only affect the carbon footprint, it affects a whole variety of other aspects of environmental footprints. And fortunately, these things align very well. So it's dramatically lower water use, dramatically lower land conversion for food production. And so those are additional large environmental benefits that come out of this. And then last, on the shifting diet, there's a huge potential benefit in terms of human health. And this is something that we looked at from the standpoint of how do you motivate the behavior change. And there was a study that was done a few years ago that looked at how big the effect of unhealthy diets is on a variety of aspects of human health. And the irony that comes out of it is that if you look at the estimates that come out of this, unhealthy diets have a bigger effect than unsafe sex, alcohol, drugs, and tobacco combined in terms of global influence on human mortality. And the other striking things is how well aligned diets are that are good for the planet and diets are that are good for people. And so looking at the mortality effects of shifting diets towards more of a vegetarian style diet, and this, when I include this is vegetarian, vegan, and pescatarian, so ones where there's a shift to the animal production coming from the ocean. The estimates are, in that case, 12% lower human mortality rates associated with these kinds of diet shifts in people. And the biggest effect comes from a pescatarian diet, which is why there's this potential for enormous human health benefits that align with the carbon benefits we're talking about.
So in a sense, the tropical forest community should be in favor of work on the ocean community here, right? Exactly. They go together.
They're linked.
They're linked, exactly. And I'll refrain from any joke about drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Manzi, nature-based solutions. I'd like to shift to that item there. Mangroves, seagrass beds, et cetera. Tell us a bit more about what the report actually is recommending with these.
The thing with this section of the report is actually the reduction in greenhouse gases is just the cherry on top. The other core benefits are the primary benefits that we are looking at. So in terms of healthy mangroves, we know that where there are cyclones, the losses that communities face will be much lower if you have an extensive mangrove compared to a scenario where there aren't healthy mangroves or there has been degradation. Biodiversity benefits that will benefit sectors, whether it's fisheries, tourism. In addition to that, you have a traditional medicine that comes from these mangroves, wide range of species that these mangroves support, seagrasses included. So there are a whole host of benefits. What was really interesting is this report also talks about seaweed farming. And that was very innovative because it hasn't been brought into the limelight when it's actually a very big industry. It's about 11.7 billion estimated, and 99% of the production is happening in South Asia. So, and it's emerging and developing economies where it's providing food, alternative fuel, and alternative for feed and jobs. So I think this report, in addition to the GHG emissions, I think what was exciting was the whole host of co-benefits.
On that, you mentioned jobs. So jobs with like mangrove restoration, jobs with the seaweed farming. That's a big deal?
Exactly. And I'd also like to mention something while we are talking on this is, so the positive impact is definitely on jobs. So if there's fair payment of restoration work across the community, then this will lead to decent work. Restoration of mangroves have led to employment. But the interesting thing we found in this analysis is implementation of the policy is very important. Often blue carbon ecosystems are pushed internationally without engaging local communities. And these local communities, for them, these ocean spaces are very important in terms of getting their livelihoods and food. So ensuring that policy is implemented in such a way that there is engagement with local farmers, fishermen, would be very important to get all the benefits that we are talking about in the report in terms of jobs and improvement of livelihoods.
Thank you, Manzi. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump now to energy, the energy segment. As we saw from the waterfall chart, the ocean-based energy was the largest contributor in terms of gigatons per annum by the year 2050. Peter, I turn to you on this one. I'm curious to learn a bit more about these offshore technologies. Tell us a bit more about where do you see the exciting opportunities in particular? I have a question on the floating wind. I just have this image of when the wind comes, isn't that thing just going to bend over and fall into the sea?
Yeah, actually, it's quite interesting from the control routines that people have to. This is getting into engineering, but the control routines people had to make in order to make sure that a floating wind turbine doesn't really, it can turn over, as you say, but it can also begin to vibrate. That's actually the biggest problem because you get into resonance frequencies. And so the control routines there are actually quite important. And they have developed this starting 10 years ago with the first floating turbine outside Norway and now having wind farms with these opportunities. So, but floating wind turbines is really, the cutting edge right now. It's yet more expensive than bottom fixed, but the potential for mass production and standardization and really huge turbines is there, particularly for floating, because they are independent of the local conditions on the seafloor, and you can go further offshore where you have bigger wind resources, and you can really exploit much more energy in these turbines. And the thing is that it's expensive. The bigger you make them, I mean, these are like several football fields in the area that they span. So it takes courage and it takes capital to move this along. But once that is going, it's really has a huge potential.
And then fixed stationary wind.
Yes.
You know, you fly in parts of Europe, you see it as you
Yeah.
fly in one of the airplane. Is there a lot of? Is it really? Are we scratching the surface? There are a lot of places you can do this.
This is the North Sea in particular, but it's interesting. I mean, this doesn't say in the report, but why is Europe leading this right now? I think, you know, US has been leading wind turbines. Well, US has been leading wind turbines technology for 30, 40 years, and you have wind resources and you have possibilities. And I think some of the things that have, you know, led Europe to take the lead here is the fact that you have, first of all, you have relatively good grids on land that can take on these variable renewable energy. You have property rights, you have sort of market incentives that can make this happen. And I think that's actually where US is lagging behind. We didn't dare to write it in the report, but that's my...
It's the only place the US is lagging behind.
No, but no, you know, getting this on, and it's beginning to happen now. But actually the leader in the next decade is probably going to be China. They are really running up on this field as in many others.
Are they, so just on the stationary wind, so China, you see a lot of planning going forward right now?
Yeah, really strong. And again, we have reached, you know, cost parity with bottom fixed wind turbines now. There's no subsidies, not at all. This is just competitive with electricity from other sources, and electrification is really part of the energy solution, right? Electricity, so transport and other areas. So the potential there is actually bigger. Of course, it's not, wind resources and accessibility is not equally distributed around the world. So this solution applies more to some regions than other regions. And that's the same for some of the other options as well. So we have to look at that. You know, not all countries have mangroves, not all countries have access to offshore wind resources, but they combine.
The final one I want to ask you a question on is the floating solar. We saw some pictures of that. Where is that taking off?
Well, it's beginning mostly on freshwater and sort of sheltered areas, because it's daring to put floating solar on the high seas, so it's kind of an early stage compared to the offshore wind.
Great. In terms of the wider impact, we saw that chart near the end of your presentation with all the SDGs, the 5 interventions, and the co-benefits, but also the trade-offs. I'm curious, Manzi, I mean, you were part of that analysis. You know, countries have sustainable development goals as part of their targets, right, and their agendas. So how would these 5 interventions that we talk about in this report help countries in the SDGs? Is there a nice fit?
Mm-hmm. The reason why we wanted to look at SDGs and the wider impact is because, as you said, governments don't only care about reducing their greenhouse gases. They also care about creating jobs. They care about economic growth and food security targets. So it was really important for us to look at the impact across these 16 SDGs. And what we found is the co-benefits outweighed the trade-offs. And by this, we meant that there were, when we looked at these individual SDGs and the indicators and doing an extensive literature review to understand how these intervention areas would impact these SDGs, we found really strong correlation with the economic and the social benefits. So in terms of improving coastal livelihoods, in terms of better health outcomes from moving to more nutritious diets, from reduction in air pollution, not only creation of jobs, but opportunity to improve gender parity as these sectors expand. So that was a really big positive. Some mitigation options showed higher co-benefits. I've talked about restoring and conserving the vegetated habitats, these mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. But overall, I think the message was clear that the co-benefits outweighed the trade-offs. That said, we shouldn't be ignoring the trade-offs. It's important, as Peter mentioned in his presentation earlier, that they should be addressed and they can be addressed. And only when concerted action is in place to address these trade-offs, we will get the whole host of co-benefits.
So Steve, on that question, were there any trade-offs that struck you as something that we need to be very aware of?
Well, I think this is an issue where since we considered so many sectors in this report, that there are interactions between them that no one's been paying that much attention to. But if this is going to become a large part of the solution, we really need to be focusing on how do we design these implementations in ways that reduce these kinds of trade-offs. So a perfect example, if we look at wind farm, there are particular locations where that's going to be profitable and highly productive as a source of power. And part of the situation is then what other kinds of conflicts does that create with other uses? How do we think about then looking at the design of those? And so there's actually an effort going on right now that was stimulated by this, which is really thinking about looking at the design for parts of the world where marine protected areas may play an important role in helping deal with some of the overfishing problem. How much of an alignment is there in terms of ideal places for protected areas with wind farms? Because to some extent they have constraints in terms of the kinds of activities that can go on around them. So that's one class of things which I think, is an example. But I think that's one of the things that was really powerful for me about this report is it's identified a variety of things that we need to be focusing on, not assuming that these trade-offs are going to be big, but thinking about how you could actually implement these solutions without it. I mean, so if you look at the foods side of this story on aquaculture, I've already talked about the efficiency side, but that provides the potential to having really effective spatial planning about where you do it in a way that minimizes conflicts with biodiversity and fisheries and shipping and a whole variety of other things along those lines. I mean, just to give you a sense, if you go with the most efficient production of marine food, mussels, you could produce all of the projected growth in meat, all the projected growth in demand for animal protein by 2050 in an area that's less than the small continental shelf around New Zealand. That's a whoppingly small area compared to what it would take if we were to produce that much more food on land. And so what that allows you to do is be very strategic about where you place these. So yes, there are trade-offs, but this allows us to get out front and think about how do we do this in a way that allows us to capture the benefits and minimize the trade-offs.
Great. I'm going to do one more question before I go to the Q&A. So get your questions ready. One last question for you, Peter. We haven't talked about carbon capture and storage under the seabed. The IPCC 1.5 degree report more or less said that we're not going to get there unless we do some CCS. This was a new piece to really in this report about diving into subsurface, seabed storage. What's the potential?
Well, actually, there is a IPCC special report back in 2005-06 looking at CCS, carbon capture and storage, and also looking at storage in the ocean. In this report here, we restrict ourselves to sub-seabed storage because of various issues with going into the water column. So the issues are partly environmental, potential for leakage of CO2 to the ocean environment. That's something that has to be addressed, and not only on a short time scale, but on long time scales. And that can probably be solved in most cases, but it requires serious attention. And the other is cost competitiveness, that a coal-fired power plant fairly close to the coast probably has to install capture facilities which cost quite a bit, and you have to use more energy to run this capture process. So you have to factor that into the equation, and then you have to, make the storage facility work. So this is not, we're not saying that that is not possible, but we're just saying that there is not a lot of evidence and experience with that to make us say, this is something we can go for. We need more research effort on that.
Great. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists. I'm now going to turn over to a Q&A. I got up now, so I'm not in the line of fire. It's those three. And here's the rules of the game. Just raise your hand. I'll take 3 questions at a time. When you do, please stand up. We have 2 runners, with one right here, one over there with microphones. Please say your name and the organization you're with, and then ask the question. We're not looking for speeches, but you can keep your question to like 20 seconds. That maximizes the time we've got for everyone to get their question asked and the panelists here to actually respond. So The floor is open for questions. Just raise your hand right here, right there, and right here. Those are the first three. Don't worry, you have your chance.
Okay, good morning. Great report, and congratulations to WRI and Norway and the others who are part of the panel. Two quick questions.
Who are you?
Oh.
That's the
Those
first
of you who
question, my
don't know
question.
me, I'm Sally Ozell with the Stimson Center.
Yeah.
Thank you. Run the environmental security program. So really good report. And quick question is, in 3 weeks, Norway is hosting our ocean conference, and foreign leaders and environmental ministers from around the world will be there, representing many of those who are on the high-level panel. Will you have an opportunity with this group to be able to roll out all these great findings? So that's question number one. That's very general. And then question number two, which is specific, which is probably for Steve, is how are marine protected areas playing a role in the resilience around climate change?
Great, thank you. Thank you. Next question was back here. Yes. Can't hear you. Is the light green?
It was green.
Turn it around.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
My name is Josh Rangvi from Climate Advisors. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the mechanism for seabed carbon storage. It sounds like you're talking about capturing carbon from coal plants and storing it in the sea.
Okay. And the final question is right down here in the blue. Right down here.
Hi, my name is Naris Torres. I'm with no organization. I just want to ask, why was ocean pollution not included in the solutions? And was it too difficult to quantify?
Okay, great. So 3 questions. Panelists. Our ocean conference, how MPAs play a role, more of an explanation on seabed storage, and then why not a discussion around ocean pollution? Any takers? Maybe Peter, do you want to do the seabed?
Yeah, well, certainly at the Our Ocean conference, the world leaders will be there, as you say. I know that the high-level panel's Sherpas are meeting, and I'm meeting with them as well. So exactly what will be said in the main conference, I think we will have to wait and see. But certainly this is an opportunity that will not be missed. We will not have yet another report by that time. But so I expect the focus to be on this one and on the potential for using the high-level panel further in this area. So carbon storage. So what that amounts to is, if you start with a coal-fired power plant, preferably along the coast, the exhaust gas contains CO2 between 3 and 15%, depending on the power plant. What you have to do is to have a capture facility, and there are different technologies for doing that, amines and various technologies. So you have to build that on top of the power plant, and I won't go into all of this. And then you get the CO2 separated from the exhaust gas. You typically then pressurize and liquefy it in order to be able to transport it. And then you have pipelines. You can also use ships, high pressure tanks in ships, but you typically transport it by pipelines, and then you would have a pipeline to the seafloor, say on the continental shelf at some depth, and you would have drilled wells through the seafloor, maybe hundreds of thousands meters below the seafloor, where you would actually inject by high pressure this liquid CO2 to replace either in an empty oil field or in an aquifer, a water-filled reservoir. So that's how the operation goes. That's what it's about. And the issues for environment is we don't want any leakages along this pipeline, which is soluble. We have CO2 pipelines on land. Maybe you know in Texas people have been using CO2 for increased oil recovery in many, many years, and other places. So CO2 pipelines is possible to do. Drilling wells in the seafloor is possible to do, and injecting liquids in the seafloor is also done in terms of oil and gas, offshore oil and gas. So each of these components, technologies are available, but the only experience we have from subsea bed storage of CO2 at the moment is not from CO2 from power plants, but CO2 from natural gas streams in the North Sea and north of Norway, where the capture process is much easier, but the transport and storage is similar to what we expect here. So, yeah, I hope that works.
Okay, great. Any taker on the role of MPAs, Steve?
I'll do that one. So MPAs are playing a very important role, and they have a big role to play going forward in terms of some aspects of climate resilience. As you can imagine, creating a marine protected area doesn't in any way stop a lot of the chemical and physical changes, because there's nothing you can do at the border to keep the water from getting hotter or more acidic or things along these lines. But what it can do is reduce the impacts of other kinds of threats and also lead to a more robust ecosystem in places where we've had extensive overfishing. And so it's really kind of reducing the combination of threats makes the system potentially more resilient in the face of some of the climate threats that are going to be there. And so there's, yes, in many cases, this is an important component of the package of solutions, and it's an area that the world has been making bigger and bigger commitments to, but there's a lot of potential scope for improvements in that space.
Great. On pollution, any comments?
I'll say something, and if you have something to add. We were mainly looking at solutions based in the ocean in terms of how they can address the climate change issue. Plastics, a lot of the issue originates from land, and it's a problem from there. It flows into the solution. That said, we are looking at ocean plastics as one of the areas under the blue papers that the high-level panel is producing as one of the 16 blue papers. So it would be, I think, given how extensive the issue is and how much we need to cover, perhaps it's better placed to sit separately and looked into with a lot more attention.
Peter.
Although there are also side benefits and side effects. So, for example, for maritime shipping, sulfur reduction from shifting fuels from sulfur-rich fuels to either low sulfur or new fuels is going to reduce that kind of pollution. So it's factored in some places, pollution, but it's not the focus in itself here in the climate focus of this report.
And in the high-level panel report that comes out in June of next year, there will be a much longer conversation around circular economy around the ocean, how to deal with pollution, et cetera. So that will come there. So three more questions. Here, here, and here. Here, here, and here. You need to have broad vision to catch all this here.
Good morning. I'm Megan Maswell with Meridian Institute. Thank you so much for sharing the findings of the report today. My question is really about where do we go from here? So obviously tremendous ideas in here and the ability to quantify that to the carbon change that we'll be able to make with them. But how do we go beyond this? And how do we create the enabling conditions and the policy contexts that are going to be required to actually actualize some of the solutions that you proposed?
Great. Where do we go from here?
Hi, John Hanson with Paradigm Project. Really impressive, and I can't wait to really dig into this report. One of my questions is about the balancing, modeling and balancing the impacts of CO2, ocean acidification, temperature rise, et cetera, on biosequestration, shells, coral impacts, things of that nature.
Okay, just talk. And over here in the back.
Good morning. My name is Nicolette Williams. I'm from the Embassy of Jamaica. Thank you for your presentations and for excellent report. You've made a compelling case for aquaculture and the need to resort to fish-based diet as opposed to animal-based. And I wanted to get your feedback as to how you reconcile that with ocean pollution and ocean acidification, which both affect the health of seafood. And thank you.
Great. All right, 3 questions. Peter, it sounds like you're ready.
Yeah, maybe where do we go from here? What happens with these recommendations? So this was a report that was commissioned to the expert group to have it written, and we've delivered that report. The high-level panel also has an advisory network consisting of, companies and NGOs and others. And the 14 member states or heads of state in the high-level panel also look for coalitions action coalitions that can take forward some of these areas. So those are emerging in these various areas. There are some industry players and some other players who are going together and trying to follow up this. So of course we hope that these networks will expand and that others will follow it up. But that is happening, and it's part of the high-level panel mandate, going beyond my responsibility as part of the expert group, but it's something that the high-level panel and together with the advisors is certainly looking into.
So the other two questions actually had a lot of similar components in terms of thinking about changes in the ocean as a result of climate change and the consequences that those have and the limits that those may have to solutions. And it's a really important point, because if you look at all of the aspects of this from the food side of the story, the benefits that we're talking about and the potential benefits you could gain by new actions really depend upon the level, the scope of climate change that these systems are having to deal with. And that's going to be also true for some of the other components of this system, of these solutions. And so just as an example, I mean, we did an analysis that showed that if you look at the production of fisheries, by fixing fisheries, we can actually produce more food and have more fish in the ocean. If you, the cost that we've had of overfishing is what's providing us that opportunity to have an upside from, we can take a management action that produces more food, and that has benefits in the context of these kinds of diet questions. However, the stronger the impact of climate change, if we look at the different scenarios, up to about a 2 degrees C scenario, we forecast that global production from wild fisheries, despite the fact that climate change has a negative effect on ocean productivity, that global production can be higher than it is today because there's more of an upside from fixing the management problems that we have created than there is a downside from projected productivity changes with climate change. That totally goes away as we go much above 2 degrees C. That the potential of having the future be better than today becomes impossible. So there's important feedbacks in some of these solutions that motivate climate action because the potential for some of these components of the solution really start to go down as the extent of climate change gets worse. And so that's I think a really important feedback that we have to be taking into consideration.
Any other thoughts on these? Peter?
Maybe just quickly, I mean, it's a well-functioning ocean is required for these things to work and also for additions to work. And I think also when it comes to pollution, I mean, eating food from the ocean requires a clean ocean, doesn't it? I mean, it's very simple, but eating more, we have it even more important to have a clean ocean in the future.
I mean, I'll ask a question for a moment. I mean, we talk a lot about eating lower on the food chain, even from the ocean, right? You know, oysters and mussels, but they're also filter feeders. So if there's a lot of microplastics in the ocean, does that mean that those filter feeders are getting the microplastics in them? But that's actually a personal question for what do I eat tonight?
It is a good question, and the answer is yes. They do consume microplastics, as do things higher up the food chain, which accumulated as a result of their consumption of things lower on the food chain. So, and also, I mean, not to leave you with a downer, the plastic in food is not just an ocean problem. It's true in a very big way with land-based foods as well, because we have a lot of plastic in the environment on the land as well as in the ocean. So this is a problem that has global impacts from the standpoint of something that we need to fix. But it definitely is true for consumption in the ocean. So you are indirectly going to be eating some plastic as a result of eating things from land or from the ocean.
I don't know if I say good to know or not. Other questions here. Right here is 1, 2, 3. We have a few more rounds. I'll get to you. So 1, 2 in the blue, and 3 was right there in the second row. Okay.
Randy Shostak, reporter with EOS at the American Geophysical Union. A two-part question. One is I'd like to know from each of you, what's the most exciting aspect of this report for you? And second, can you each talk about the political will that would be required in this country and other countries to get the job done?
You've got the microphone now over here, right? Yep, you start and then you'll be the next.
Yeah, my name is Fei Yu from the Asian Development Bank. It's very encouraging to hear progress in offshore wind. So my question is for Peter. We're also trying to encourage private sector investment in various renewable energy sources, including an ocean financing initiative. So my question is related to how do you encourage more cutting edge technologies being adopted in, for example, in Asia? What is the distance from this technology to commercialization? Is it at an experimental stage to make mechanism work, or is it near commercially viable? Second question is about the existing fixed wind turbines. I'm sure these are already feasible or viable in Europe without subsidy. Could you give any examples in Asia, whether there are any projects that are operating on a commercial basis without subsidies? Thank you.
Great, great. Final question over here.
Sure, thank you. Diane Hoskins with Oceana. I thought the graph showing the areas of action areas in terms of the mitigation to climate change extremely compelling, and in particular the role that offshore renewable energy can play. And so building on your question, you spoke to the fact some of the enabling conditions that are necessary in order to successfully go down that path. And I think two things that were mentioned were financial incentives, as well as the land-based grid needs. And so if you could speak a little more to those and any other enabling conditions that will be needed in order to actually implement that action area. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, 3 questions. I think one was definitely geared towards you, Peter.
While we all think about what's the most exciting part and so on, maybe I could go into the offshore wind. So we talk about technology and we talk about research on that area and moving to bigger turbines and so on. Actually, what is perhaps even more important is the financial conditions. And the fact that the interest rates are going down and the existence of other places to put your pension fund money these days is decreasing, increases the attractiveness of, in general, renewable energy, but including offshore wind. Why? Because they are characterized by high investment costs early on and very low running costs compared to a coal-fired power plant where you have to buy the coal every year and have less investment. So long-term financing and low, interest rates is really, really important. And the stable financing environments, the way governments can also do this in terms of taxation and so on, is really, really crucial. And I think that applies to Asia as well as to Europe. Looking at those factors there. And I think the way things have developed in Europe recently, it's been very, very effective with the competitions for, delivery of energy at a sort of a difference price. I can talk about details, offline, but that's the way of having a competition for developing the best technology and having the build-up of these power plants. That's exciting to me, and I think I don't offhand know a cost-competitive example of bottom-fixed wind in Asia. No, I don't. But I know there's a big activity. Countries like Japan, which are very active, have not much shallow shelves. They have much deep water. So they are maybe a little bit coming into that area. And then Korea and China is also quite active, but it's not, to my knowledge, yet there. But I think you have to work on the same areas. What is most exciting? Again, the magnitude of each of these, and I'm also quite keen on the food from the ocean, I must say. There are so many aspects with food from the ocean in the future. I think we have so much unknown, so much untried in terms of unfed aquaculture, lower trophic levels, exciting things. I mean, I go to chefs back in Bergen, Norway, and they try out things like mesopelagic fish, and you try out, resources that we never really tried to do anything about. And as Mansi said, we have very short experience with aquaculture compared to agriculture. We haven't found the species that are going to be our staple food in 100 years from now. I don't think so. And we certainly haven't developed them into a way that we can work on it. So that's an exciting point from a researcher's point of view, I would like to say.
Great. Mansi?
So the question I'm addressing is, what's exciting?
Yes.
Okay.
And then coming to political will next. Yeah.
So what was exciting for me, as I mentioned early on, was the fact that it looked beyond the climate-related benefits. It looked at the non-climate benefits, which is an important decision factor for many governments. The other thing, what also comes up, that came up in our panel discussion, which I thought was very interesting, is all these 5 areas don't sit in silos. They speak to one another, and there can be a lot of integration where some of these benefits multiply. And that would be quite exciting to find where, there are exciting overlaps and we can have a cumulative effect. So that would be probably what's exciting for me. The second question.
Political will. How are we going to build political will for these recommendations? You can always pass it to Steve too. He looks.
I'll pass this to Steve.
Oh boy.
How are we going to build? So I share Mansi's excitement about the kind of intersections between these different areas, because I think on the one hand, that was the challenging part of this effort, is to pull together these really diverse things. But what came out of it was the fact that all of us started thinking about other parts of the system, I think, in different ways. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, I think this is a conservative estimate of potential, that if we take this starting point and actually really run with it, that there are opportunities to expand this even further with greater benefits. How do we motivate these? I think one of the ways you do this is, in fact, through co-benefits, because a lot of people respond and actions are driven by a variety of different motivations. And so to the extent that there are multiple co-benefits, we have to exploit that in a very big way, because some will be motivated by the climate benefits per se. Other ones, we are going to have to be viewing the climate benefits as a co-benefit from something being driven by something else. And I think in the food system, you're probably going to motivate more behavior change on diets by health arguments than you are by climate change. That's just my perception. That may, there are other ways to deal with that in terms of costs, but that kind of leads to a third one, which I think is, we have to really start thinking about, in each of these sectors, what are the incentives that are that could be implemented that would actually enhance the likelihood of these things moving forward. And Peter talked about some of those, but also what are the incentives that are in place today that are actually barriers? Because if so many of these things have economic benefits and co-benefits, why aren't they already happening? And that's, I would imagine, in every single one of these cases, it's because in a lot of different settings, we've got barriers that are blocking this, and incentives that are motivating other kinds of actions that we need to think about. How do we change those rules? And that's something that likely varies from country to country, where I think one of the important things we need to do is also take this analysis down to the level of individual countries. What are the things that are most relevant at the scale of individual countries? Because that's where we're probably going to see more action happening in the short term.
Before we close, I'm going to take a couple more hands. I saw a couple of hands over there, people being very patient, right there, and see the Caitlin, and right here, and right here. That'll be the final 3. So Caitlin, do you have the microphone already? Right there? Perfect. There, here, and where was the other one? Here. Go. You're up.
Thank you. I'm Waz from the University of Notre Dame. Mansi, you mentioned the dual wins of job creation and the preservation of fragile ecosystems if we fairly compensate that kind of work. And I wholly agree with that statement. However, to consider it a sustainable solution in the long run, I think it has to be financially viable. So I was wondering if you have looked into policies or new business models that might make it so. Are there any examples existing or recommendations? Thank you.
Right here.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Lewis. I'm from NOAA's National Weather Service, and I'm really interested in Pacific Islands and the notion of disproportionate impacts on small island states. And while I was really interested in the mangrove and other sorts of solutions, many of the solutions that we've been talking about don't seem to meet the technological development that's available in some of those small island countries. And I just wondered, will there be a paper that talks about how we might help the smaller island states in particular?
Great. And the final one right here.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Shamini. Thank you very much for your presentation and for the report. My question is in relation to floating solar. I work for a renewable energy developer, and currently there's already 1 gigawatt of floating solar that's installed in a number of countries, including in the United States. And a lot of small island developing states are also turning to floating solar. Sri Lanka, for example, has a partnership with the government of Canada, where I'm actually from, to develop 100 megawatts of floating solar in a reservoir in that country. So as more and more small island developing states are going to turn to this as a solution because land is a huge problem for them, there needs to be conversation, dialogue, because as we saw with the start of renewables, people didn't understand the technology, which meant financing didn't quite flow to that. So is there a place which is fostering the dialogue between private sector, governments, the stakeholders, so there's an increased understanding of the technology, there's a place for lessons learned of best practices for all these projects that's already been built?
Great, thank you. Any takers on these questions?
Okay, I can go first on the restoration question. So yes, that's very important in terms of understanding, looking at the costs and the cost effectiveness and the various business models. In fact, the report does talk about that. What it says that in some, there is an issue in terms of scalability. When you look, there isn't a lot of economies of scale when you come to restoration work. And that is something that needs to be improved. That's something that the report talks about. It talks about new schemes that needs to be researched, but also better accounting, taking into account some of these core benefits. How can you materialize that in terms of actual payments of ecosystem services? So definitely agree that, you know, cost is an important factor that we need to consider. I just wanted to also answer the Pacific Islands question. It is something that also the report talks about, especially when it comes the various sector, and I'd like to bring an example of the shipping sector, where it says that development of hydrogen or decarbonizing an international fleet will have a large impact on small island states, especially in terms of the resource impact or the costs that would fall on them. The burden on industry in terms of switching to low or zero carbon fuels is going to be high. So I think it is important to think about how you support these countries as well in terms of helping them make that transition. I don't know, Peter, if you want to.
Well, thanks to both of you for bringing the attention to SIDS and Pacific SIDS in particular. Of course, we have Fiji and Palau on the high level panel. But I think, and in particular for floating solar, that gives me the chance to underline the big difference between solar energy, photovoltaic solar energy, and wind. That wind is economies of scale. You can never make this wind energy really competitive if you have a small household, single household wind turbine. Whereas solar energy, you can actually do that. And there are sheltered areas in particular that you mentioned, which are useful for lend themselves to even floating solar. But there are also combination opportunities. I mean, back in Norway, we have people putting floating solar on top of a floating fish farm. And it's actually quite useful because the water keeps the photovoltaic cold, which is good for the energy capture, and it also is good for the light and for the fish. So there are these combinations which could also be of relevance to Pacific Islands. Also, again, there are projects looking at offshore wind to produce electricity, to produce hydrogen offshore, to be used for vessels coming by to fuel stations. So you can go directly from offshore wind to maritime fuel, which would be applicable in every area where you have the possibility to do that. You can put that on islands, you can put that floating as well. So there are all of these exciting opportunities. Some of them are kind of high tech and for the big population centers maybe, others are more low tech and easily distributable. And it's important that we pay attention to all these aspects.
Steve, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just coming back to your point about the Pacific Islands. I mean, I think it raises a more general point about the country level differences in terms of not only opportunities here, but also when we look across the other blue papers, the likely impacts on the blue economy having very serious geographies to them. And we have to really take that very seriously in terms of thinking about what this means from the standpoint of options within countries, but also the kinds of actions that are going to have to be taken at international level. So the other blue paper that I'm helping lead is one that's looking at the impacts of climate change on the blue economy, looking at fisheries and tourism and a variety of other sectors. And we have done individual country level projections for every single one of those. And it, of course, is dramatically different depending upon where you are on the planet and how the different sources of the climate impacts also have geographies to them. And so this is raising a variety of different kinds of limits and opportunities within countries, but it also raises climate equity issues that are really going to come into play from the standpoint of thinking about the lack of opportunities in some places or the disproportionate ways that some countries are going to face these costs. And what does that mean from the standpoint of international action? And that's where I think it's so important that the high-level panel has pulled together such a wonderful group of countries to think about this as not just an individual set of issues, but actually an international issue.
Great. With that, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. You can take your seats. You can take your seats. Great. Well, you heard it from the authors' mouths directly here. So I'm glad you all came here. Just I just want to wrap up with a few thoughts here. So first of all, I think thank yous are in order. First of all, to the embassies in the United States that co-hosted this event. These would be the embassies of Chile, Fiji, Jamaica, Kenya, Mexico, Namibia, Norway, and Palau. Thank you very much for co-hosting this event. All of your heads of government are members of the high-level panel, and we thank them as well for all their contributions to this important work. I'd also like to thank the ambassadors that came here and shared their wonderful remarks to help set the stage for this, the ambassador from Norway and from Chile. Thank you very much. A round of applause for the ambassadors. I'd like also to thank Norway in particular for their support for this entire initiative, as well as the president of Palau, along with the Prime Minister of Norway, are the co-chairs of the high-level panel. Without their leadership and bringing along their peers, none of this would be possible. Also like to thank my colleagues here at WRI that helped make today possible. Those of you that are here, I see Erica, I see Emily, Brian, Kate, and the others. Just going to give a round of applause for those. There's a lot of work. A lot of work goes into making an event like this, and so I really appreciate it. And also to we have some ocean people here at WRI that work here, but also the director of the Secretariat, Christian Teleki, is based in London, so he couldn't be here today. But he and his team with Nick and Eliza and others put a lot of work in helping get all this here, so we can just show it off here in Washington D.C. So much appreciation to my colleagues there as well. This isn't it. This is one event, and this is one report. As the ambassador from Norway mentioned, there's a whole series of blue papers that are going to be launched starting next month, all the way until May of next year. We plan to actually have about 3 or 4 more events here in the DC area for the DC audiences, where we'll be launching or relaunching a number of these. We won't do all 16, that's a little bit too many, but we'll do a subset where we think that are of relevance to the audiences here. So be on the lookout for invitations to our next event it'll happen before Christmas time for the blue papers. And finally, the final recommendations, the scientific synthesis and the final recommendations of the high-level panel will be launched in the first week of June in Lisbon at the UN Ocean Conference. That's when the final report and recommendations and how do you build the political will will be coming out from the high-level panel. Just want to close by saying that last week was kind of a historic week. When you look back at it, we had a report that came out from the IPCC talking about how bad things are for the ocean. The ocean has been on the front lines of the climate change battle and has a lot of bruises because of it. At the same time, right, we came out with a report the same week saying, yes, the ocean is a victim, but it's also going to be part of the doctor to this great challenge called climate change. And I'm hoping that basically this is an agenda, this is the beginning of a new agenda around the ocean as part of a solution to be accentuated by your government and the ambassador in Chile in a couple months from now, basically almost exactly 2 months from now at the Blue COP, where this once again, and we're hoping this is the start of a steady drumbeat, is yes, ocean is a victim, we have to save it, but also it's part of a solution, so let's invest in it. It's fundamentally critical. So I'm very looking forward to the Blue COP as an extension, and accentuation of the messages from this report and from today. And let's just remember, as we heard in the video that kicked off today, that as I like to think about it, the ocean is too big for us to allow to fail, but it's not too big for us to do something about it. So with that in mind, let's all go home, do our part, keep this on the agenda, right? And we'll reconvene and hopefully see you all at some of the subsequent events we have. Thank you very much.